Chapter 15, Legacy, Lessons, Relevance. So much to do. Clarke's proposed title for his never-completed autobiography would have been a good one. Throughout his long life, each of his major achievements seemed to lead to a new challenge with even higher stakes. From championing military preparedness before 2 world wars to protecting American civil liberties, including academic freedom and civil rights for African Americans, to the eternal struggle for world peace. What he achieved and, as important, what he attempted adds up to one remarkable life. Of course, taking on such enormous problems virtually guarantees there will be no total victories, and Clarke would have been the first to point out that his successes were not unqualified. Within Clarke's most impressive accomplishments were some of his most disheartening failures. The Plattsburgh Camp movement was an extraordinary success, yet he still could not sell his ultimate goal of universal military training. 25 years later, his winning passage of the 1945 Selective Service Act was leavened with bitter disappointment that Congress never approved the more comprehensive national service program he hoped would follow. Service was a constant theme, although he backed away from the draft during the Cold War and deeply disapproved of U.S. intervention in Vietnam. Clarke never wavered in his belief in duty and a citizen's obligation to serve in some capacity. Had his attention not been diverted by the compelling issue of preventing a Third World War, it is easy to imagine that he would have continued to call for some kind of national service along the lines of expanded civilian conservation corps that Clarke and Franklin Roosevelt collaborated on without success in the 1930s. Clarke's principled and effective opposition to FDR's court packing plan almost certainly cost Clarke a seat on the Supreme Court, an unknowable but probably great loss to him and to the country. Some of Clarke's successes were fleeting, such as his celebrated ABA Bill of Rights Committee, which was a force under his leadership, but withered as soon as he left it. Does that make it a failure? The Gobbitis family would think so. Frankenfuckenstein family, whatever. Nor would many Americans whose civil liberties were upheld in West Virginia's Board of Education versus Barnett, the case in which the court reversed its ruling in Minersville versus Gobbitis. The same would hold for the CIO or countless other organizations whose right to public spaces to gather and hold public conversations was affirmed in Hague versus CIO 1939. Did Clarke's efforts significantly advance civil rights for African Americans? It depends on how you measure. Clarke's legal, financial, and advisory support to the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund deeply strengthened and sustained that important organization in its critically early years. Yet huge racial disparities remain within the American legal and judicial system. Clarke recognized the markedly uneven application of the death penalty between races as just one sliver of that vast problem. He would likely point out how far the country has come in a relatively short time, but would also urge Americans to continue the fight and never let up. Vast problems take time to resolve, but they also take resolve over time. And what to say about world peace through world law? Despite Clarke's unflagging efforts, especially in his last 3 decades, the world seems further from anything resembling world peace than ever. Or is it? Americans who lived through the Cold War perhaps forgotten, and increasing numbers of young people did not experience. The quiet daily dread of those years, backyard fallout shelters, air raid drills in grade schools, annihilation-themed movies like On the Beach. The top 40 songs like Eve of Destruction, not to mention the awful phrase and nihilistic logic of mutually assured destruction, which chillingly became a part of the national vocabulary. At least now, in these plenty troubled years of the early 21st century, the Harvard professor Lawrence Lessig can suggest that we are on the cusp of this time where I can say, I speak as a citizen of the world, without others saying, God, what a nut. There is evidence to back up Lessig's claim, while Clarke's specific solution, world peace through world law, never came to fruition. Slow but notable progress in international justice has occurred. An early United Nations colleague, Sir Muhammad Zafrullah Khan, a Pakistani jurist who served on the first United Nations International Court of Justice, was later the court's president and remembered Clarke's deep interest in the International Court. He understood well, without a wider acceptance of international adjudication as the normal way to settle legal aspects of disputes between states, the rule of law cannot be established in the world community. Khan and Clarke would have both been pleased to know that the very same United Nations International Court of Justice in 2008 conducted high-profile trials of Serbian military leaders for genocide and other war crimes in the brutal Bosnian War of the early 1990s. While some protested the ultimately mixed verdict, the very fact of the trials and their international legitimacy was a landmark achievement. An international trial with a more decisive outcome was concluded in 2012 when a UN-backed international tribunal convicted and sentenced former President Charles Taylor of Liberia to 50 years in prison for his role in atrocities committed during Sierra Leone's civil war in the 1990s. It was a watershed case for modern human rights law. Taylor is the first head of state convicted by an international tribunal since the Nuremberg trials after World War II. His trial lasted 4 years and was conducted in an international criminal court near Hague's Peace Palace, which houses the United Nations International Court of Justice. Separately, the long-envisioned International Criminal Court, ICC, which exists outside the United Nations, was formally chartered when the Rome Statute took effect in 2002. A decade later, the ICC is finally a reality, with headquarters also just outside The Hague. In accordance with its charter, the ICC is the first permanent, treaty-based international criminal court established to help end impunity for the perpetrators of the most serious crimes of concern to the international community. Its jurisdiction includes genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. What about human trafficking? Active cases on the ICC docket, as 2013 ended, involved the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Central African Republic, Darfur, Sudan, Kenya, Cote d'Ivoire, and Mali. Perhaps too slowly and perhaps too spottily, but international justice is beginning to be realized. Grenville Clarke's decades of effort and influence were steps toward that still elusive and evolving goal. How to best explain the apparent contradiction between Clarke's efforts towards world peace and his earlier military preparedness campaigns? If it seems paradoxical, the simple truth is that Clarke was an unusually complete and complex human being, with every paradox that implies a capitalist who defended socialists, a lawyer who enjoyed breaking the occasional rule, as when he brought members into the porcelain's hallowed halls, a crusader for public causes who represented the ultra-elite homeowners in the Long Island Parkway case, a defender of civil liberties who was silent about the internments of Japanese Americans during World War II, and during that same war sought to indict isolationists under the Espionage Act. The list goes on. This paradox extended to individuals. Adversaries became allies, and vice versa throughout Clarke's life. Franklin Roosevelt, Felix Frankfurter, Burton Wheeler, and James Conant are but a few of Clark's friends and sometimes close associates who at one point or another found themselves on the wrong side of his public or private crusades. Nobody got a pass. It was all about actions, not the person or his relationship with Clark. Conversely, disagreements, no matter how contentious, rarely killed a friendship. In some ways, this reflects Clark's legal prowess. Competent lawyers must be prepared to argue their opponent's case as well as their own. But while many successful lawyers grasp that tenet tactically, Clark took it to the much deeper and more essential level of basic human understanding and genuine empathy. An associate described Clark as the consummate legal professional. He never forgot that part of being a lawyer is being a professional man in the best sense of the word. He never forgot his obligations to the public. He utilized opportunities that the freedom of being a professional man afforded him to embark on his many great endeavors. There are many pedestrian, brilliant, money-saving, successful craftsmen in the law. There are rich lawyers. There are famous lawyers. But even some of the attributes that Grenville Clark exemplified can make of a lawyer a mighty person. Clark also understood that paradox is part and parcel of the democratic tradition. He wrote and gave lectures on the rich and complicated traditions of English American liberty, with characteristic emphasis on the lessons of history. In one particularly eloquent passage, he drives home a subtle but crucial point. American English liberty is the opposite of doctrinaire. Rather, it has developed out of the experience of self-government of the English-speaking peoples over a period of centuries. It is pragmatic, plastic, and adaptable. Consequently, it is non-logical, non-symmetrical, and full of inconsistencies. On the other hand, by reason of these very characteristics, it has proved eminently workable under varying conditions. Princeton President Harold Dodds encouraged Clark's daughter, Mary D., to pursue a biography of her father, saying, "A life story of him would be an inspiration to college students. I could have used it in the course I taught at Princeton. He never sought personal fame or popular credit, yet the range of his contributions was so broad: higher education, federal affairs and war and peace, civil rights, etc. They add up to an impressive example of what one able and honest man can achieve." The recollections of Clark's friends around the world offer insights into the major imperatives of that life. Educate. John Dickey, the longtime president of Dartmouth, remembered Grenny's talk on all subjects, revealed an abiding faith in the power of education. Needless to say, his concept of education reached far beyond the classroom. He had a fastidious taste for good thinking, but he was not afraid of considered conviction as part of the educational process. Above all else, he kept saying, education will ultimately bring the people of the world to understand their stake in lawful community. And if they understand it, he would say with closing finality, they'll get it. Act. The lawyer, banker, and presidential advisor John J. McCloy said in terms of his range in mind and effectiveness in achieving what he set out to accomplish, I am not certain I ever knew his equal. He was one of the most liberal-minded men I ever knew, and yet his singleness of purpose when he set out to marshal the forces needed to accomplish his objectives was about as liberal as a railroad train plunging through a tunnel. A particularly apt benediction of Clark's memorial service was, "Blessed are the peacemakers." But the accent is on the verb. Clark's accent was always on the verb. Collaborate. Lloyd Garrison, a Root Clark associate, said, "By letting the other fellows talk, Clark never seemed to be running the show, but he always managed to steer it in the direction he wished. He had clear and simple objectives, nothing fancy or erudite, but practical and down to earth. He was patient, humorous, and always gave his committee members the feeling he was enjoying each of them as human beings even more than the work of the committee. They responded in kind and would have done anything he asked. Collaboration can include good-spirited coercion. Kingman Brewster Jr., president of Yale and two-time Dublin Comfrey, called Clark the operator extraordinary, nothing that more people found themselves doing and saying and endorsing things they would have never dreamed of. As a result of being goaded, cajoled, wheedled, kidded, and sometimes duped into it by Grenny, I was such a willing victim. Another presumably willing victim was Pope John, 1958 to 63, on whom Clark operated in the cause of world peace. When a dinner guest suggested in 1965 that Clark influenced Pope John's just released Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth, John's final major papal treatise, Clark responded with a twinkle. He was a pope and I am a Unitarian, but we are thick as thieves. Remain independent. Clark prized his independence perhaps above all else. Asked in later years about his famous resistance to holding public office, Clark responded, "My late wife, half in fun, you've never taken public office because you've never been willing to take an order from anybody. The nice way of putting it is that I want to preserve my independence." Fanny Dwight Clark knew her husband well, and it is important to recognize that Clark's cherished independence was totally different from the anti-government modern-day Tea Party perspective. He applied pressure from outside government to improve the system, not to destroy it. Government was not a dirty word to Clark, whether it referred to local, national, or international authority. He supported the League of Nations and sought to improve, not destroy, the United Nations. No vigilante, Clark worked within the existing legal structure. When that structure was found lacking, he attempted to change, improve, modify, and often expand it through appropriate and legal political means. A perceptive journalist once wrote, "Clark is deeply conscious of the danger of a community splitting into isolated or opposing elements. The words abolition and union mean far more to him than forgotten phrases of a forgotten war. Finally, and especially, think big." The NAACP director, John Greenberg, said Clark had faith and vision and capacity to make large commitments and think in terms of the future of the nation and even the world. Senator Alan Cranston of California said, "I've never known anyone else who combined as deep a concern for and grasp of infinite detail with a seeming ability to cast his mind out beyond the horizons to the edge of infinity." Clark might have added one of his favorite Abraham Lincoln quotes, "As our case is new, so must we think anew and act anew." As Clark himself told the American Bar Association when he accepted his medal, "I wish that our thinking shall not be crippled by the timidity or undue regard for tradition, but shall be as imaginative and creative as the problem is vast and new. I further wish we may resist any temptation to avoid the hardest problems. Thinking big and acting on it can, of course, be greatly aided by wealth." Grenville Clark did enjoy the undeniable advantage of wealth, with the freedom it can bring to serve, pursue public causes, and take on entrenched powers. Yet many have had far more and done far less, and inherited wealth can be a handicap. Well, geez, I'd fucking sure love that handicapped. W.K. Vanderbilt famously called it as certain a death to ambition as cocaine to morality. When I.F. Stone joked about Clark's having overcome a handicap worse than poverty, being born into the highest circles of wealth and social position, The journalist may not have been too far off the mark. The iconic American self-made person is not lessened by acknowledging that serving to improve one's lot is a logical human impulse. Less heralded but deserving of note is the person born to ease and comfort, who chooses to work hard and give off him or herself to public causes. Noblesse oblige is perhaps taken for granted at times. While Clark was generous with people and causes he believed in, he didn't pretend to be a philanthropist. He would know, having had Andrew Carnegie and the Ford Foundation as clients. This was a man who co-founded the Fiduciary Trust Company and wrote three generation skipping trust to shelter wealth for future family members of his family. This was a man who co-founded the Fiduciary Trust Company and wrote the three-generation skipping trust to shelter wealth for future family members of his family. He was a careful investor, and his annual financial review weekends were serious business. The family financial advisor would come to Dublin, where Clark and the head of each household, once the family became multi-generational, would be gathered. They would review each of the complicated investments in the family's portfolio line by line and make buy, sell, or hold decisions made for each stock. Buy when blood is running in the gutter was a memorable Clark battle cry, but Clark's contributions were bigger than money alone. Intelligence, far-sightedness, organizational skills, leadership, and determination to achieve worthy, well-defined goals. A friend noted that Clark was fortunate in having the conveniences and assets of inherited wealth, but I doubt that its absence would have substantially affected his approach to life. You sure about that, bud? You sure about that? So how best to remember Grenville Clark? It is remarkable that even so deliberately a private man could accomplish so much for so long, yet leave so light a historical footprint, which is not to say that Clark's legacy has been completely relegated to the ash heap of history. The congressional record on the day of his death contains a formal statement noting his achievements as a great American. His portrait hangs at Harvard among other luminaries of the corporation. Luminaries, huh? Illuminaries. He appears briefly in the biographies of many of his more famous friends and in the annals of the many organizations to which he gave so much of himself. He was the subject of dozens of articles, interviews, and profiles in the popular press, in scholarly journals during his lifetime. Literally tons of his papers are collected, cataloged, and available for research at Dartmouth College. Physical monuments exist in the form of Clark's Botanic Garden on Long Island and Clark's beloved Dublin Farm on Dublin Lake at the base of Mount Monadnock, which is still in the family. Many Clarks, including Grenville and Fanny, rest peacefully in the quaint Dublin cemetery at the edge of town. And if one way of having arrived in America is to have to put your picture on the U.S. postage stamp, Grenville Clark Qualify's daughter, Mary D., led a successful campaign to bestow that honor on her father in 1983. Mary and others also formed the Grenville Clark Fund at Dartmouth to recognize and reward individuals who exemplify Clark's ideas for furthering world peace, good government, academic freedom, civil rights, and personal liberty. Yeah, that explains that explains a lot. The fund is no longer in operation. Yeah, because it probably got donated to the Boston Company. Probably got donated to like some environmental cause. The fund is no longer in operation, but its awardees were impressive. Archbishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa. Oh, cool. For his work against apartheid. George Kennan, noted Cold War diplomat. Jean Monnet, founder of the European Common Market. Theodore Hesburgh, president of Notre Dame. Jack Greenberg, director of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Sidney Cartridge, civil rights activist. Marian Wright Edelman, founder of the Children's Defense Fund. But there should be more. We could use lessons of this life, its purpose, its substance. Although Clark's circumstances were too rare for him to serve as a literal role for most Americans, he nonetheless stands as a defined example of an informed, active citizen, the kind on which our democracy was modeled, and that it needs to thrive. Cicero said, "In a democracy, the most important office is that of the citizen." The line was quoted most appropriately at a memorial dinner for Clark in New York City by his friend Paul Freund, a professor at Harvard. Freund added, alas, it's all too infrequent that office is adequately filled. But surely, if there ever was an exemplar of that truth, it was our friend Grenville Clark.